Hello everybody, welcome to Museum at Home with me, Cheryl Morgan. Today I want to talk to you about one of my favourite museum artefacts. It's this thing. Now don't worry, I haven't stolen it, this is a replica, but I did buy it in a museum. In fact, I bought it in the British Museum in a special gift shop that was associated with their Sunken Cities exhibition. That's the one which featured the Egyptian cities of Heraklion and Canopus, which are now beneath the waters of the Mediterranean. Now, when I saw this in the shop, I knew that it was something special and I wanted to have it. But it might not be completely obvious to you as to what's special about it, and that's what I want to talk about today. And this is going to be a story about Isis syncretism. So what's that all about? What is syncretism? Who is ISIS? Well, it's nothing to do with Islamic terrorists. And syncretism is a system that the Romans used to help them integrate people into their empire. The Romans conquered lots and lots of countries all over the world, and everywhere they conquered, there was a different group of people with a different religion, and they had to make sure that those people would be happy being part of the Roman Empire. Now, they realized they couldn't do that by saying, you have to worship our gods or we'll call you heretics and burn you. That just wouldn't have worked for them. So instead, what they did was they took a look at the local gods and said, you know, your gods are really quite like ours. That god that you've got that is representing lightning and thunder, he's just like our Zeus. And that other goddess that you've got that represents love and fertility, that's just like our Venus. So actually, you folks are worshipping the same gods as us, and you can carry on worshipping them. We'd just like you to change their name every so often. Now, here we have an example of them doing that. My local Roman city is called Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis. And that's built around some hot springs, which the local people said were sacred to their goddess called Sulis. And the Romans took a look at this and they said, you know, Sulis reminds us a lot of our goddess Minerva. So they built a temple at the baths to a goddess they called Sulis Minerva. And if you go and visit Bath, you can see her in amongst the exhibits that they have. And that's an example of syncretism at work. So who is Isis, the person in our artifact? Well, this is her in an example at the Brooklyn Museum. She's often pictured with a small boy on her lap. So Isis was an Egyptian goddess associated with being a wife and a mother. Her husband, Osiris, was one of these agriculture gods that dies in the winter and is resurrected again in the spring. And Isis, as his loyal and loving wife, was responsible for bringing him back to life. She's also the mother of Horus. He's the god with the falcon's head, and he was very much associated with the pharaoh. He was the young hero god of the Egyptian pantheon. So we've got there a goddess who is seen as a mother with her young boy who is going to grow up to be a heroic god. So what's the difference between that image in the Brooklyn Museum and this one that we've got here? Let's start with this funny hat that our Isis is wearing. Now, the Egyptians already had a goddess of childbirth. Her name was Hathor. You can see her here from the Luxor Museum in Egypt, and she was often shown with the head of a cow. When she didn't have that cow's head, she had a special hat with cow's horns and a sun disk in the middle. Now, when the Romans arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians already had 3,000 years of civilization behind them, and that's a long time for your religion to evolve. So by Roman times, the Egyptians were already looking at Isis and Hathor as essentially the same goddess. They were both associated with motherhood and with childbirth. And that's why our Isis is wearing Hathor's crown of cow horns. Now, the other interesting thing about this little statue are these little fellows here. As you can probably see, they are lions, and that's a very unusual feature to see in a statue of Isis. But lions are actually very common when associated with another goddess. Here she is. Her name is Cybele, and she's originally from Turkey. This particular statue is in a museum in Istanbul. And Cybele, amongst other things, was a sacred goddess for Roman trans women. But she was also known in Rome as Magna Mater, the Great Mother. So she's another goddess associated with motherhood. And what we're seeing here is Isis, Hathor, and Cybele, all goddesses of motherhood, all brought into one single figure. Incidentally, as a quick note for my friend Sasha Coward, that isn't the only example of Cybele being involved in syncretism. Here is another one. This is the Syrian goddess Atargatis, who is normally shown as a mermaid, but here she's actually got feet, although her dress appears to have a bit of a fishy tail here. But she's also sitting on Cybele's lion throne. Now, Atargatis was also associated with trans women, so it's not surprising to see her associated with Cybele in this way, but it was really surprising to me to see Cybele and Isis together. Was this real? Was this something that the Romans actually did? Well, one of the clues to this comes from the city of Pompeii. Archaeologists were surprised to find that there wasn't a temple to Cybele in Pompeii. And this is unusual because Cybele was a really popular goddess in Rome. She was popular all over the empire, even as far away as here in Britannia. So to not have a temple of Cybele in Pompeii was unusual. Also, some of the frescoes in one of the houses they uncovered looked as if they had been painted by or for people who were particular devotees of Cybele. So you would have thought they would want to live somewhere where there was a local temple. Now, there are possible explanations from this. One possible idea is that Cybele worshippers who lived in Pompeii would go down the road to the nearby city of Herculaneum, where there was a temple to Cybele, so they could have done their worship there instead. But another explanation was that perhaps the temples of Cybele and Isis worked very closely together, and if you worshipped either goddess, you were welcome in that temple because the Romans felt that they were sort of the same person. So, having bought this lovely little statue, what I did was start to do a bit of searching on the internet to see if I could find a picture of a real artifact like this. It wasn't in the British Museum. It wasn't in the list of special artifacts that they brought in for the Sunken Cities exhibition. So I began to get a little bit worried. But then I found it. It's in Vienna, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And back in 2018, I was lucky enough to be invited to Austria to speak at an academic conference. And I made a point of going to the museum and taking that photograph so that I knew I had seen an original object upon which this can be said to be based. So, real example of Isis, Hathor, Cybele syncretism from Rome. But that's not the end of Isis's story, because she's become associated with other things as well. One of the things that happened in the Roman Empire is that Isis became associated with the sea. And this is the back of a coin minted in Alexandria, where you can see Isis holding a ship's sail in her hands, and also in the background a picture of the famous lighthouse from Alexandria. So Isis became known as Isis Pelagia, Isis of the oceans, and Isis Faria, Isis of the lighthouse. And she was worshipped by sailors all over the Roman Empire. And then there is another goddess who, or religious figure, shall we say, who is well known for having a child on her lap. Here she is. You can see that she's wearing a blue cloak, which is perhaps symbolic of the sea, and her name, Mary, is very much like mare, which is the Roman word for sea. Now, when the early Christians were trying to convert people to their religion, they would quite often use syncretism. Here in Britain, for example, they would take the local Celtic goddesses, people like Bridget, and say, this person is a saint. So you get all of these local saints who are local gods reinterpreted as Christian saints. And we can quite easily imagine how in early Rome, the Christians would come to potential converts and say, you don't have to give up worshipping Isis. You can worship her with us. She's just got a bit of a different name. Thank you.